Testing. Okay. Sorry, I accidentally turned it off. Um, so I was just saying about the simple past tenses. And as I said in the previous on Journal 1 about how it could be in the present tense, it could be saying, for 2 hours I walk the streets, I see them from every gate of flame darts, if you wanted to do that. But then notice there's a change, and the change actually I noticed starts with the sentence for. For she might have stepped out of the gateway. I'm going to put that up here too, under the modals. Let's see, can you see all the way over here? Here, let me see if I can move it just a little bit. Yeah, there we go. So if I put over here, might have stepped, and then likewise, if we keep going, of gateway around the been sitting, but okay, but other to it. Okay, so these are what are called modes. So if we have a simple verb like the one I just already mentioned, I go, I went, I walked. Okay, a modal is they call modal verbs. These are the ones I think of as modal verbs: would, could, might, should, may, and so there's a whole group of those: would, could, might, may, can, must, ones like that. And they're called modals because you can add them onto a regular verb and they create a different mode, if you will, a different meaning to the verb. And often it's what we might call contrary to fact, like if I had, that means it didn't really happen, but if it had. And another one might be if it's something that's just true all the time. I don't think he actually uses the term modal in the way I mean it I get it as meaning exactly those. Basically what he means is when we go into some other verb tense other than the straightforward narrative, this happened, this happened, this happened. Anything that says talks about a generality. So for example, in the one I read in Journal 1, every time somebody do that to me, I beat him up. So what's he saying? He pulls out of the narrative to talk about something that's generally true. And at that moment, he's doing evaluation. So the bigger point is not to get all bogged down in exactly what a modal is just to be aware that Labov, as a linguist, is saying you can tell a difference. Evaluation often is marked by a difference in the nature of the verb, the kind of verb that either makes it something that's contrary to fact or that makes it something that's sort of a general truth about me or about the situation or about life or whatever, something like that. So, so here we have, so then he keeps going over here. If we keep reading it, he says, for had she touched me with the match of her eyes, I should have gone up like a magazine. And so I take that to be the evaluation. It didn't happen, right? Well, actually, we don't know if it happened. If it had happened like after the part we read, then that would be part of the story. She touched me with the match of her eyes, and I blew up like a magazine. Probably not literally, but that's the idea. He's saying that she's so powerful, that if she sees him before he sees her, he's going to explode. Or is that right? Something, yeah. If she had touched me with the match, yeah, it's sort of like her eyes have this power. And so you notice, by the way, how he's using this metaphor that he's imagining himself as like the magazine of explosives, and her glance or her look is the match. And if she touches him with her eyes, boom, he's going to blow up. I hope this didn't turn it off. There we go. I got to be careful. So that's the idea. And so that's the evaluation, is the part that in this case goes contrary to fact. If this had happened, it didn't, but if it had, then, and so now he's making a general truth. And this is like the so what of the story, right? This is why it's a cool story, is because she is so powerful that if he had seen her, he would have blown up. And that, you can imagine that would happen anytime, anywhere, in a sense. So don't get too bogged down on the modal thing, but that's what it means. Okay, hold on, let me pause for a second. Okay, I'm going to go on to departures. Let's read that together. That's at the bottom of page 15. This is a very interesting one. So I'm going to read it and then talk a little bit about it, okay? The September day, notice by the way, I think Storm is a woman. One thing you guys want to watch out for is, get the gender of the writer or the person being written about. Try to get that clear. Some of you were saying he when it was a woman, or vice versa. Just double check on the gender. It helps to read the introductory material, right? So I'm going to read it, okay? The September day we left for London was cold and cloudily sunny. In the few minutes as the train drew out past the harbor, I felt myself isolated by a barrier of ice from every living being, including the husband facing me. Like a knot of adders uncoiling themselves, one departure slid from another behind my eyes. Journeys made feverish by unmanageable longings and ambitions, night journeys in wartime, the darkened corridors crammed with young men in clumsy khaki, smoking, falling asleep, journeys with a heavy baby in one arm. At last I come to the child sitting in a corner of a third-class carriage, waiting, silent, tense with anxiety, for the captain's wife to return from the ticket office. A bearded gentleman in a frock coat, the station master, saunters up to the open door and says, smiling, something she makes no attempt to hear. Her mother walks lightly across the platform. Ah, there you are, Mrs. Jameson. Your little girl was afraid you weren't coming, he said amiably. Nothing less amiable than Mrs. Jameson's coldly blue eyes turned on him and cold voice. Nonsense. My child is never afraid. Not true. So that's her mother, right? Her name's Jameson. So one thing I want to point out is I think some of you caught this, I'm not sure all of you did, that she's remembering herself as a little girl. This is not another person. It's her. And this might be a place where if you want to explore the difference between, well, as you do, the difference between natural narratives and literary narratives is the language and the sort of this fancy way she does this. So if we go through it a little slowly by slowly, I felt myself isolated by a barrier of ice from every living human being, including the husband facing me. So, boom, that's in the second sentence, and we have a conflict already. Evidently, she's not getting along very well with her husband. Okay? That's in the present. Like a knot of adders. Adders are like snakes. So a knot of adders would be like a bunch of snakes all knotted and wriggling together, okay? Uncoiling themselves, one departure slid from another behind my eyes. So what's happening here is she is remembering in that departure that she's having with her husband, whom she evidently isn't getting along with, or he isn't getting along with her. She starts to go into her head and remember all the other train trips she's had where she departed, okay? And then we kind of get a list of them. Journeys made feverish by unmanageable longings and ambitions, maybe when she was a younger woman. Night journeys in wartime. So the darkened corridors crammed with young men in clumsy khaki, probably World War II, I think. Smoking, falling asleep. Journeys with a heavy baby in one arm. That would be when she had a child, I suppose. So maybe we can imagine she has a child that's older now, but when she was a younger woman and had a baby. At last I come to the child sitting in a corner of a third-class carriage, waiting, silent, tense with anxiety. This is her. She's remembering herself as a small child. And so the captain's wife is her mother. She's talking about her mother in the third person. She's talking about herself in the third person because she's remembering it all in her memory as if she were somebody else. Okay? So I think that's important to realize, and you could argue that the way she does that, right, is sort of literary. And the rich metaphorical language, the way the sentences are long and sinuous, and you have to kind of reach in there and work it out yourself. It's not right on the surface. So then, having said that, let me just talk a little bit about. I found that it had a long orientation. The complicating action, the orientation is all that going back and back in her mind. But I think it's more than orientation. It's already complicating. This is how it gets complicated, because it's already complicating action as soon as we know that her husband is separated from her by a barrier of ice. There's a whole sense of coldness in this, isn't it? It's interesting. Her name is Storm. I don't know if that ties into it. So in a sense, we got complicating action right from the beginning, and you could argue in this little anecdote, complicating action and orientation are intertwined, because the orientation is already creating this sense of conflict and coldness and isolation and separation. But perhaps then you could say the whole thing down to getting her into the past, to her being a little girl, is orientation, and it's not the real story doesn't start until the bearded gentleman in a frock coat, the station master, comes up. Notice, by the way, that that's in the present. So when she finally gets to that distant memory, that's really the story, if you will. She tells it in the present, as if she's kind of seeing it happen, And So I didn't find, I did find, a lot of you didn't find an evaluation there, but to me, the evaluation is the very end. Not true. In other words, my mom got it wrong. My child is never afraid. No, her child is afraid. And the not true to me is the evaluation. It's something along the lines of my mom never really understood me, if I were going to go more deeply into it, or my mom always thought that I was brave and that I never got afraid. She had expectations for me I couldn't meet. We could tell a whole more stories out of this gap, if you will, this icy barrier that she now is feeling between her and her husband. So what we're finding is she's seeing a pattern of repetition, that the separation or the fear she's feeling in relation to her husband ties back to something she felt way, way back when she was a kid with her mom. So, and all this is done in a very short period of time. And that condensation might be something that you might say, is that different between a literary and a natural narrative? So I'm beginning to kind of hint at you at some things you can look at for what makes literary narratives maybe different, right? Again, we might go back to the polar bear story, though that's complicated because the story she tells in the polar bear story is supposedly a natural narrative that her aunt or whoever she was told. So that one's complicated because it seems to have a natural narrative inside of a literary narrative, though we might wonder whether in writing it she made it more literary than maybe her aunt or whoever she was, her cousin, would have made it originally, if you can follow that. So see how I'm kind of already like brainstorming how I might explore the difference between natural and literary narratives as I go through this.